Hello, and welcome to Historical Humans Reads, where we take primary sources and bring them to your screen. I'm Colum Coleman, and today we are reading from The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. The Prince is considered a cornerstone of political philosophy and the foundation of modern political theory. Composed in 1513 while in exile from his native Florence, Machiavelli dedicated his handbook on autocracy to rivals, the ruling Medici of Florence, who had themselves returned from exile only to exile him. Today we will be reading chapters 14 and 15, that which concerns a prince on the subject of the art of war, and concerning things for which men, and especially princes, are praised or blamed, from the prince. With that, let's begin. Chapter 14. A prince ought to have no other aim or thought, nor select anything else for his study than war and its rules and discipline. For this is the sole art that belongs to him who rules, and it is of such force that it not only upholds those who are born princes, but it often enables men to rise from a private station to that rank. And, on the contrary, it is seen that when princes have thought more of ease than of arms, they have lost their states. And the first cause of your losing it is to neglect this art. And what enables you to acquire a state is to be a master of the art. Francesco Sforza, through being marshal, from a private person became the Duke of Milan, and the sons, through avoiding the hardships and troubles of arms, from dukes became private persons. For among other evils, which being unarmed brings you, it causes you to be despised. And this is one of those ignominies against which a prince ought to guard himself, as is shown later on. Because there is nothing proportionate between the armed and the unarmed, and it is not reasonable that he who is armed should yield obedience willingly to him who is unarmed, or that the unarmed man should secure among armed servants, because there being in the one disdain and the other suspicion, it is not possible for them to work together. And therefore a prince who does not understand the art of war, over and above the other misfortunes already mentioned, cannot be respected by his soldiers, nor can he rely on them. He ought never, therefore, to have out of his thoughts the subject of war, and in peace he should addict himself more to its exercise than in war. This he can do in two ways, the one by action, the other by study. As regards action, he ought above all things to keep his men well organized and drilled, to follow incessantly the chase, by which he accustoms his body to hardships, and learns something of the nature of localities, and gets to find out how the mountains rise, how the valleys open out, how the plains lie, and to understand the nature of rivers and marshes, and in all this to take the greatest care, which knowledge is useful in two ways. Firstly, he learns to know his country, and is better able to undertake its defense. Afterwards, by the means of the knowledge and observation of that locality, he understands with ease any other which it may be necessary for him to study hereafter, because the hills, valleys, and plains, and rivers and marshes that are, for instance, in Tuscany, have a certain resemblance to those of other countries, so that with a knowledge of the aspect of one country, one can easily arrive at a knowledge of others. And the prince that lacks this skill lacks the essential which it is desirable that a captain should possess, for it teaches him to surprise his enemy, to select quarters, to lead armies, to array the battle, to besiege towns to advantage. Philopoemen, prince of the Achaeans, among other praises which writers have bestowed on him, is commended because in time of peace he never had anything in his mind but the rules of war, and when he was in the country with friends, he often stopped and reasoned with them. If the enemy should be upon that hill, and we should find ourselves here with our army, with whom would be the advantage? How should one best advance to meet him, keeping the ranks? if we should wish to retreat, how ought we pursue? And he would set forth to them, as he went, all the chances that could befall an army. He would listen to their opinion and state his, confirming it with reasons, so that by these continual discussions there could never arise, in time of war, any unexpected circumstances that he could not deal with. But to exercise the intellect, the prince should read histories, and study there the actions of illustrious men, to see how they are borne themselves in war, to examine the causes of their victories and their defeat, so as to avoid the latter and imitate the former. And above all, do as an illustrious man did, who took as an exemplar one who had been praised and famous before him, and whose achievements and deeds he always kept in his mind. As it is said, Alexander the Great imitated Achilles, Caesar Alexander, Scipio Cyrus. And whoever reads the life of Cyrus written by Xenophon will recognize afterwards in the life of Scipio how that imitation was his glory, how in chastity, affability, humanity, and liberality Scipio conformed to those things which have been written of Cyrus by Xenophon. A wise prince ought to observe some such rules, and never in peaceful times stand idle, but increase his resources with industry in such a way that they may be available to him in adversity, so that if fortune chances it, it may find him prepared to resist her blows. Chapter 15. It remains now to see what ought to be the rules of conduct for a prince towards subject and friends. And as I know that many have written on this point, I expect I shall be considered presumptuous in mentioning it again, especially as in discussing it I shall depart from the methods of other people. But it being my intention to write a thing which shall be useful to him who apprehends it, it appears to me more appropriate to follow up the real truth of the matter than the imagination of it. For many have pictured republics and principalities which in fact have never been known or seen, because how one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live, that he who neglects what is done for what it ought to be done sooner affects his ruin than his preservation. For a man who wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue soon meets up with what destroys him among so much that is evil. Hence it is necessary for a prince wishing to hold his own to know how to do wrong, and to make use of it or not according to necessity. Therefore, putting on one side imaginary things concerning a prince, and discussing those which are real, I say that all men, when they are spoken of, and chiefly princes, for being more highly placed, are remarkable for some of those qualities which bring them either blame or praise. And thus it is that one is reputed liberal, another miserly, using a Tuscan term, because an avaricious person in our language is still he who desires to possess by robbery, whilst we call one miserly who deprives himself too much of his own use. One who is reputed generous, one rapacious, one cruel, one compassionate, one faithless, another faithful, one effeminate and cowardly, another bold and brave, one affable, another haughty, one lascivious, another chaste, one sincere, another cunning, one hard, another easy, one grave, another frivolous, one religious, another unbelieving, and the like. And I know that every one will confess that it would be most praiseworthy in a prince to exhibit all the above qualities that are considered good, but because they can neither be entirely possessed or observed, for human conditions do not permit it, it is necessary for him to be sufficiently prudent that he may know how to avoid the reproach of those vices which would lose him his state, and also to keep himself, if it be possible, from those which would not lose it. But this not being possible, he may with less hesitation abandon himself to them. And again, he need not make himself uneasy at occurring a reproach for those vices without which the state can only be saved with difficulty. For if everything is considered carefully, it will be found that something which looks like a virtue, if followed, would be his ruin, while something else, which looks like a vice, yet followed, brings him security and prosperity. This has been an excerpt from The Prince on Historical Humans Reads. If you enjoyed this video and would like to hear more excerpts from original texts, please subscribe to be notified of the next one. If there is a work you would like to hear, be sure to like a video and leave a comment listing it below. And before we sign off, I would like to encourage you to look forward to next week's Historical Humans Reads, where I will be covering a response to Machiavelli's The Prince, Frederick the Great's anti-Machiavel. Additionally, if you so wish, I would also encourage you to look up the Humanitarian Collections, our web shop, which is currently supporting the Trevor Project, an organization dedicating to helping LGBTQ youth. Thank you for listening.